So alright guys, we got some parts in. Two t-shirts here. I'm going to be giving the owner of this car one of these. And it's another package we got here. Looks like we have the front main seal for the car and the O-ring that goes with the collar. Set those aside. Bought another Mac Tools valve spring compressor, so that way I'll have one. Can't have too many. Alright. And finally we have another Pelican parts box here. Wadded up sticker and let's see what we got here. That's one of the seals for the air oil separator. There's the other. Just wanted to make sure I had it. Alright, we have the air oil separator seals here. See, the smaller one is the one that goes up top. And we have two tie rods. Alright, I began the last video by removing the air oil separator, and I'm going to begin this one by installing the new seals for it. You can see the smaller one goes on top here, and the larger one goes on the bottom. So alright, I have the new air oil separator seals on now, and I've got the block wiped off, so I'm getting ready to install it. So alright guys, I've got the early front main seal here and the later front main seal. If you have an early car, you're going to need this 55mm one here. And if you have a later car, 85.5 I believe, they're going to be 52. So just keep that in mind. Alright, we're getting ready to put on the front main seal. This is the 55mm seal since this is an early car. And I'm going to just line it up right here. And here is my front main seal tool. See, I have everything sitting flush. So alright, you can see how my tool pushed that in, and now I just remove the tool and we're finished. So I've got the oil pump sleeve here, putting it on. I always put a little bit of oil on it before sliding it in. So once you have it in, you want to make sure you turn it a little bit and work it in until it goes into place. And then next you're going to take your green O-ring and put it on, and that's going to sit just inside that sleeve there. Finally, you're going to take your washer and slide it on just like that. So alright, now we're going to be changing the camshaft seal here and also the collar. So alright, I changed the O-ring on the back here, and this little white thing here that you find in your head gasket set goes right here. You just pull it up and replace it. So we now have the new cam seal and collar installed, and also the O-ring. Alright, this little onion skin that you find inside your head gasket set goes on the end of the cam here. You just take it and gently slide it on. Use the old collar here to help. And then that sits between the camshaft and this collar here. So our front end reseal kit came with a new triple square bolt for the cam. So that's what we're going to be installing here. So now we're going to be installing the rear cam tower cap, and I always install the cork gasket dry, and I always find it's easier to install it with the cam tower on the car. Alright, we're making some progress. I'm getting ready to put the intake on, and I thought I'd just walk you around, show you some of the things I've been working on. I've got the cam sprocket on now, and the back of the belt cover on. You can see I cleaned that up real nice too. And been going around replacing any of these clips that I find that hold the wires in place. Also got the oil filler neck on, and you can see that there's a zip tie there. I always make sure that I replace these as well. And then I got the neck for the heater core put on. Now I must say that this is easier to do with the head off, so I usually just remove this along with the head and then put the gasket on and it back on before putting the head back into the car. So just something to keep in mind, because it's really tight getting in there, and then you have to make sure that you have the oil filler neck off and the gasket in its correct orientation. So I find it's just easier to do all of that with the head off. And in here I've got the upper radiator hose on. So we're just about ready to go here. I am going to be changing the AAV, or auxiliary air valve. I've got a new one here, and that should just about do it, and we'll put the intake on. So I went to all the trouble to put the new AAV in, only to find that this one has a different connector on it, and they don't seem to be compatible. So alright, I guess I'm ready to put the intake on now. I had to put the old AAV back on there, and I'll just let the owner know. So alright, before I install the intake, I thought that I would just show you some of the vacuum lines and how they're routed, because some of these things aren't going to be visible once I get the intake on. I thought I would start right here. You're going to see two vacuum lines here. This vacuum line here runs around the firewall and goes to right here, where you can see two nipples. And this one's going to connect to the rear one here, just like that. Now coming back over here, you can see this vacuum line here it goes down and runs to this T here. This here connects to the intake at the second port, and then goes up around, goes to another T where it connects to the fuel pressure regulator and the fuel pressure damper. Just like that. And then finally, as far as the little hoses go, we've got this one here. The one that connects to this first nipple there, like that, runs around and will connect to the first port on the intake. So these are going to go just like that on the intake. So alright, as far as the bigger hoses go, we're going to start here at the Aral separator hose. You can see it runs over here and connects to the J boot right before the throttle plate. Then you have this hose that comes down, and then it connects right there. Then you have this hose here. It's going to connect right near the airflow meter, and on this car it runs over to the AAV, and then this hose off the top of the AAV there runs around and connects to the back side of the intake. Most cars are going to have some form of this. It changes a little bit over the years, but for the most part you're still going to have some hose that connects to the back there. And if you have an 88 and later car, you're just going to have a hose that runs straight off to the brake booster. But if your car has the Venturi, it's going to look like this, and it's going to connect to a port right there on the intake. And I'm going to show you all this in detail as I put it all on. Alright, I have the intake on now, and in addition to the 8 bolts that go across the top here, you also have a bolt here. Then you have the bolt for dipstick mount and the bolt for the speed and reference sensor mount. As far as hoses go, you're going to have a hose somewhere in here. Depending on the year, they're all different, and none of them are really that easy to get. And then you have down here your Venturi or brake booster hose, depending on year. And as far as those vacuum lines go, this line here is the one that runs from that first nipple on the heater core elbow. And then this one here is of course the one I talked about going to the second port there for the fuel pressure regulator and everything. So there you go. Now that the intake is on, I'm going to be installing the fuel rail. Alright, I have the fuel rail on now, and it's starting to look like an engine again. You can see how the vacuum hoses are routed on this early car, and you can also see how the fuel lines look. And over here we have a little mount for the wiring harness going to the injectors. So alright, everything's coming together nicely. I've got the block off plate and the lower radiator hose on now. Tomorrow I'll put the sprockets on and do the timing belt. For tonight I thought I would finish up everything that's in the head gasket set. The last thing to install is this O-ring here on the throttle body. You can see that here. Alright guys, I worked late last night and got pretty much everything together. I finished installing everything that was in the head gasket kit. And now, the only thing really left to do is to get the belts on. You can see I've got the belt cover cleaned out really nice. Everything's got new seals, the water pump's replaced, and I've got the cam sprocket on. As I mentioned in my other video, I've had the cam out, so when I installed it, I didn't know where it was going to be at, and you can see this is where we're at. Now I've got to get this cam to the top dead center mark there. So as I did in my last video, I'll come over here and make sure that my pistons are far enough down. If 1 and 2 are far enough down in their stroke, then 3 and 4 will be as well, since the pistons move in pairs. 1 and 4 move together and 2 and 3 move together. So if 1 and 2 are together at mid-stroke, then the rest of them will be, and they are. So what I'm going to do here is take this and turn it. If the pistons are at mid-stroke, then the valves can open as far as they like and they will not hit the pistons. So in that case, I'm going to turn the cam until I get it to the top dead center mark. Now if you feel any binding, then obviously you don't have the pistons at mid-stroke. As you can see here, I can pretty much turn this effortlessly. For my left hand anyway, and there we go. Now we're at TDC. Now, had the pistons not been at mid-stroke or been up too far, then I would have felt binding and I would have known to stop. But since I was able to turn that easily, we know that no valves collided. So now we're going to get the first piston to TDC, and I'll show you how to do that. So alright, now that I got the cam at top dead center, I need to get the piston the top dead center, and to do that I'm going to be using something here to make sure I bring it to the top. As it comes up, I'll know that number 1 is coming up. So keep in mind that the piston goes up and down even though the crank rotates the same way. So you may go to turn the crank and it's actually going further down. That means 2 and 3 are coming to the top. Now at top dead center, 1 and 4 valves are going to be closed. So you're safe to bring 1 and 4 to the top. So if that happens, you need to make sure that you rotate the crank the opposite way to make sure it comes back up and they don't go down and bring 2 and 3 to the top, because the valves on 2 and 3 may be open. So to make sure that I'm doing it correctly, I'm going to be taking this and putting it down in my cylinder here, and then I'm going to be turning the crank. And I don't know if you can see that, but cylinder 1 is coming to the top. That means 2 and 3 are going down. And then you'll know you're at the top because the piston stops moving when you turn the crank. So now that I have the cam and the number 1 piston at TDC, we're ready to put on the timing sprocket, and it goes on just like that with this flange and the writing out facing you. So alright, at the moment I don't have an engine on the stand that has a head on it, so I'm going to try and describe this process the best I can, and once I get an engine on the stand with a head on it, then I'll remake all this and do a more clear and concise video on it. For now, I'm going to be using these sprockets here, and this sprocket is going to represent the cam, while this one will represent the crank. So as you can see here, there's a mark on my sprocket, and that's going to represent TDC. And then there's a mark down here that's going to represent the crank mark. So the factory service manual doesn't really go over this because it's written for people who are techs that already know how to install a belt, and not really broken down for people who are doing this in their garage. So when you put a belt on, most people will line up the timing marks and then stretch the belt out and put it on like that. But as you can see here, there's a lot of slack on this side of the belt. So even though your timing marks are lined up, watch what happens when you go to rotate the crank. The slack comes out of the belt, but the cam didn't move. So now you have the crank over here, but the cam still at TDC. So now your whole timing is off 10 degrees. And what that's going to do is make the engine a little down on power. You're going to notice that it's down on power. So that's not how you want to do the belts. You've got to get rid of this slack. And the way to do that is take the cam, rotate it forward about a tooth, then put your belt on and then turn the cam back like that. It's hard to do with these sprockets, but hopefully you get the idea. Now you're perfectly in time and you don't have all that slack there. So when you go to rotate the crank, the cam's going to come right with it. Just like that. So now we're going to discuss belt tension, and we're going to pretend that these are on the car and lined up. And this is going to be our tensioner. Now, on a car that doesn't have a water pump being driven by the cam belt, what can happen is if you get the belt a little too tight, it can actually start bending down on the nose of the cam, and over time it can wear it out and break the cam. So you want to make sure that with these types of belts that you use a gauge to make sure that you're not getting it too tight and bending the nose. A good rule of thumb is a little too loose is better than a little too tight. The same goes for our cars. So alright, this sprocket here is going to represent our water pump, and we're going to put it in like that. Now, once you've turned the cam back to remove the slack on this side of the belt, the tension isn't really going to go up because all the slack is going to be back here towards the water pump. And as you rotate this, you're going to need to remove the slack and then put a great amount of load on the water pump before you start pulling the cam back to tighten this front part up anymore. And you want to stop long before then. So here's what you want to do. Once you have the slack back here, you're going to turn the tensioner counterclockwise, and that's going to pull the slack out. And then once you have it set, you want to check it with your gauge, and after you've done that, you want to see if you can still move the water pump. If you can't move the water pump, there's a good chance that you've got too much pressure on it and you're bending the shaft. You don't want that. This is going to eventually wear out and break your water pump. So no matter what your gauge says, no matter what your auto tensioner does, you want to be able to turn and rotate the water pump about like that to ensure that you're not putting too much pressure on that shaft. And you don't want to be able to spin it like that or anything. You just want to make sure that it still spins freely. So alright guys, I hope that helps you better understand how to get the timing marks perfectly lined up and set belt tension. I've even had a car come to me once that had an auto tensioner that seized the water pump, so they do get too tight as well, and you got to make sure that that water pump spins, and if it doesn't, you've got to back that auto tensioner off just a little bit. So alright, I have the new timing and balance shaft belt here. This is the balance shaft belt, and here's the timing belt. So let's get it on. So alright, just to demonstrate what I mean, here's the cam at TDC, and I also have the crank at TDC. I'm going to go ahead and run the belt around where it's supposed to go. I'm going to hold this down here and try and pull that as tight as I can and put it around the cam. Now I have these marks perfectly lined up, but you can see all of this slack here. See this slack? That means when I turn the crank, the cam's not going to follow until all of this comes out. And even though I pulled this as tight as possible, you're not going to get this out. And just to demonstrate, let me hold this here and rotate the cam back. And you can see that now I'm a whole tooth off. Now I don't have any slack. So you can't have that. What's going to happen is, if you install the belt this way, you're going to, every time the car comes around, you're going to be slightly off mark. And like I mentioned, you're going to be down on performance. So the only way to fix this, and like I said, this is mentioned in just about every other manufacturer's factory service manuals except ours. You pull this forward just about a tooth right there on the cam. Now you install the belt. Now you're still going to have slack, but that's okay, because I'll show you how to get rid of it. Alright, see, you still got slack there, but watch this. Now, the car is perfectly in time. Alright, here's how everything looks at this point. You can see that everything is in perfect time. And since I pulled all the slack out of this side of the belt, you can see it's really tight. And that's what you want. But on this side of the belt, it's really sloppy. So this is what I was talking about here. On other cars that don't have like a water pump here, you just tighten it up, and you have to check it with a gauge to make sure that you're not going to be bending and breaking your cam if you get it too tight. But in this case here, you can see that all that comes around and is directly on the water pump. So as you're tensioning everything, watch how that belt gets tight right on that water pump. If you tighten it too much, it starts bending the impeller here. And of course you do not want that. As I mentioned, it is catastrophic. So you see that there? So what you're trying to do here is get the belt tight like that, and check it with your gauge if you have one. And like I said, if your gauge says that it's perfect but you can't turn this water pump about like that, it's wrong. You need to back it off and loosen it just a little bit. When the belt is tight, you're going to want to have that water pump where you can just turn it just ever so like that. Now again, you don't want to be able to spin it like that, but you want to be able to just be able to put some force on it and turn it. So alright, I'm getting ready to tension the belt, and I thought I'd use this old tensioner here to show you what I'm going to be doing. This is about how it looks sitting in the car with no tension on it. So right about now, with the belt going through it, it's sitting about right there, and then as I rotate this down, it pulls this closer to the crank, and as I rotate this up, it pulls it closer to the water pump. So keep that in mind. Like I said, mine's sitting about like that right now, and what I'm going to be doing is actually rotating it up like that until I find the proper tension. So here's the tools that I'm going to be using for the job. I'm going to be grabbing the tensioner with this here and then locking it down with a 17mm socket just like that. So alright, I now have the tensioner locked down. So alright, here's how it looks with the timing belt tension. You can see that it isn't all that tight, and I can still rotate the water pump. It takes a little bit of muscle to do it, but it's still possible to do it with one hand, and that's what you want, because as I mentioned, the tighter this belt goes, the more pressure is going to be on this impeller shaft, and it's going to wear this water pump out. So the other day someone asked me if I preferred the early tensioner or the later auto tensioner, and that's actually a pretty good question. Now if you're just changing the belt, all you have to do with the early tensioner is loosen it and the belt comes right off, and that makes belt changing very simple. However, with the later auto tensioner, you have to remove all these nuts, which can be difficult to find when it's in the car, and then remove this completely, and it's also very heavy, and then you can remove the belt. So that said, I actually prefer the early tensioner when it comes to just changing the belt. However, when it comes to doing more work like changing the front main seal, I actually prefer the later belt covers, because as you can see here, there's just a little hole here and it's hidden behind the cover here. So you have to put the flywheel lock on and then pull all the pulleys off and then remove the cover. However, on the later cars, you can just remove the belts and the tensioner, remove the bolts, and then slip this off around it. So now that the belt is on and tensioned, I'm going to be installing the belt guide for the water pump. You want to make sure that this part here is at the bottom, because that's where the balance shaft belt goes across. And there are 2 locking nuts that go on each end. Now that the belt guide is installed, I'm going to be putting the idler pulley on. And that right there will do it for the timing belt. So alright, now we're going to discuss installing the balance shaft belt. The only thing I've done is pull that engine out of that yellow 83944 and stuck it on the stand here. I have not touched anything, and I don't think I've ever had an engine that came to me that was perfectly in time, and that goes for this one as well. Just by looking, it looks like the upper balance shaft sprocket was installed wrong, and this one down here looks to be right. However, I have the crank at TDC, and the upper balance shaft is timed correctly. However, down here you can see it's about off a tooth. You can see that the mark is over here where it needs to be, right here at this plastic tab. So I now have the belt off, and I went ahead and removed this front plate here to verify that the upper balance shaft was installed correctly, and it is. Now you want to notice that both sprockets on the balance shaft are identical, and for the upper balance shaft you're going to install the Woodruff key at the mark with the O on it, and for the lower balance shaft you're going to install the Woodruff key where there is no mark at all. This one is correct, but what had happened was the little tab on the front of the plate had broken off and it spun around. So I'm going to replace it. You see how that sticks up there, and then that goes on the upper balance shaft where the Woodruff key is not, and that's going to show the O mark. That's why I couldn't see it, to verify that it was on correctly. It's alright, I've now verified that the sprockets on this engine are on correctly, and I've moved the sprockets to their timing marks. The upper balance shaft timing mark is on the back of this cover, and it should line up with the notch on the back of the sprocket. Down here there is a plastic tab on the back of the belt cover, and then that will line up with the notch on the back of the sprocket for the lower balance shaft. And the crank, of course, you're going to use the marks on your flywheel. Now, if I throw this belt on here and try and get everything to line up with the marks timed up, look what's going to happen. So this is like installing the belt with the marks lined up. And you can see that just by installing the tensioner, it's pulled the upper balance shaft well out of position. But that doesn't end there. When I go to time or tension the belt, the lower balance shaft gets pulled out of position. So now I have the upper balance shaft 10 degrees back and the lower balance shaft 10 degrees the wrong way as well. But the crank is still on time. So no matter what you do here, you can loosen this all you want, but you're not going to really get in there to do this all that great, and you're going to have a bad time. So here's the easiest way to install the balance shaft belt. What you want to do is put everything at their mark and then go ahead and rotate the upper balance shaft to that position about 10 degrees off its mark this way. So the mark is here. I've moved the sprocket to there. Next, I'm going to take the crank and rotate it back also 10 degrees or about a tooth. And then since this balance shaft rotates the opposite direction, I'm going to move it back about a tooth as well. So everything is going to be like you saw when I put the belt on. It pulled the upper balance shaft out of position, and when I tensioned it, it pulled it out of position. So what we're doing is deliberately making them out of position so that way we can put the belt on. So alright, I now have the belt on with everything 10 degrees off. This one is over here and this one is over here. And what we need to do is take the slack out of this belt by rotating the slack all the way back to the tensioner this way. You can't just rotate it this way and get it out because you're going to miss the crank. And this here, it needs to rotate in the direction that the crank turns, which is this way. So if I try and tension this down here, it's going to pull the upper balance shaft even more out of time as I turn this, and it's going to pull the lower balance shaft out of time as well. So you've got to get rid of the slack. The way to do that is just, you want to bring most of the slack up to the top of the belt, so like pull up on it here, and then rotate the upper balance shaft into time. You're going to notice that most of the slack has now moved over here to where the crank is. Next, you're going to rotate the crank, and we're going to move the slack over to this part here. So as I rotate the crank, see all this slack that showed up? So now we have the upper balance shaft in time, and we have the crank in time. And to get the lower balance shaft in time now, all you have to do is set the tension here and just watch as the lower balance shaft pulls itself into time. And then that's it. So once you have your marks lined up, you're going to want to turn the eccentric tensioner clockwise and lock it down. So alright, here's a closer look. See, my upper balance shaft is in perfect time, as is my lower balance shaft here. So once you have all your marks lined up, you're ready to set the tension. I like to have just enough where I can just touch the water pump pulley there like that. And if your gauge says that this is the proper tension, then as with anything, a little too loose is better than too tight. Go ahead and slacken it up to about right there, because These things aren't like a cam that might snap. You're not going to break these balance shafts. What's going to happen is you're going to bust the covers. And if you've ever seen balance shaft failure, it's usually just a little too tight and it busts the covers. So alright, next we're going to install the idler. And that goes on like that, and you're going to need a 0.5 millimeter or 0.5 millimeter feeler gauge. And that's going to go between the lower sprocket here on the belt and the idler. And you can see now that that's set. I have a little bit of gap between the upper belt and the pulley. So what you want to do is pre-tension the belt and get that out, and then just have it sit right against it like that. So here's how this pulley is going to look when installed. You can see my 0.5 millimeter clearance down here on the lower half of the belt. And for the upper half of the belt, you want to make sure that you get all the slack out. And even with the slack out, you can see that I still freely move the roller. And if you go up here to the upper balance shaft and you pull down on it, what you don't want to see is the belt being pushed out like that. You want to make sure that with tension on the upper balance shaft, that the belt is perfectly straight from the tensioner to the upper balance shaft, and this isn't making it bow out. So alright guys, that's how you do the balance shaft belt, and now you should be able to do it easily on your car. So alright, now I'm going to be putting the sprockets on the car again. Since I am doing the upper balance shaft, I want to put the Woodruff key where the O is. And you can see my Woodruff key here. So I'm going to be taking this one and sliding it on. So alright, here's our lower balance shaft, and since these sprockets are identical, we're just going to be rotating it and putting the Woodruff key where there is no mark at all. So next I'm going to be installing the cover plate and bolting the balance shaft sprocket on. To install this cover plate, then you need to remember which hole the Woodruff key isn't in and insert this. So on the top, this is going to go where there is no mark, and on the bottom, this is going to go in the O mark. So alright, now that the balance shaft sprockets are on, I'm going to install the crank pulleys. I now have the crank pulley on, so now I'm going to install the balance shaft belt. So alright, just to recap, this notch on the back of the sprocket is your timing mark, and it should line up with the notch on the back of the belt cover. Now to get started, the first thing I'm going to do is rotate this just like that there and leave it there. And next I did the same thing with the crank. You can see I have a little mark here and a mark here. What I did was turned it this way off a tooth and left it, and then coming over to the lower balance shaft here. Let's see, you should be able to see the notch on the sprocket there, and then that's going to line up with this tab here. And then this one, since it rotates the opposite way, you're going to turn it about like that there. And now you're ready to install the belt. So once you have all your marks like that, you can go ahead and put your balance shaft belt on. So alright, I now have my belt on with my marks where I had them. Now, as you may know, once you have the marks lined up in a certain position and you put the belt on, it's impossible to try and just walk this belt to where you want it. So that's why you offset these sprockets like that. Now what I'm going to do is I want all the tension up here at the top. So I'm picking up on the top half of the belt here, and you're going to rotate this sprocket into time. You see how that went like that? It got tight. That's what you're wanting. And then that's going to move all that slack over onto the crank now. And we now have the first balance shaft, the upper balance shaft, perfectly in time. Now what I'm going to do is do the same thing that I did here with the crank. It's alright, I now have the upper balance shaft in time, and I rotated the crank, so now it's in time, and it's moved all the slack in the belt over to the lower balance shaft. And if you look here, you can see that it's still out of time, but if you just watch this, as I turn the eccentric on the tensioner here, it pulls the lower balance shaft into perfect timing. Now everything is perfectly lined up. So alright, you want to rotate the tensioner clockwise as stated in the factory service manual. If you turn this counterclockwise, it's going to push the belt up and it's going to rub on the water pump pulley. So alright, this is what it's going to look like at your water pump pulley when you turn the tensioner clockwise. If you turn it counterclockwise, you're going to be lifting the belt up and it's going to rub on the pulley here. So just keep that in mind. Also, you'll want to set the tension about right now according to your gauge, and you should end up with something about like this. So alright, I'm turning the crank, and here's why you rotate it twice. Not only are you looking for things that may seem out of place, any binding or anything like that, but also because the cam turns at half the speed of the crank. So even though the crank has turned 360 degrees, the cam has only turned 180 degrees. Alright, I've now rotated the crank twice and brought the engine back to TDC. All my alignment marks are perfectly lined up. You can see the cam marks here, and I'll show you the balance shafts. I'll pull this back. You can see it is absolutely perfect. I'll even go down here and show you the lower balance shaft. See, it is perfectly timed as well. So alright, I have the timing belt covers on now and the distributor cap. The only thing left to do is put the airbox on, fill it with coolant, and we'll fire it up tomorrow. But I still need to work on getting the new tie rods in. So that's what I'm going to be doing now. I'm going to go ahead and open this up and try and get it on tonight. It's alright, if you've never done a tie rod before, what you can often do is count the turns it takes to unscrew it. That would be 1, that would be 2, and so on and so forth. I've already done this and got 14 1/4. And then I took this old end and screwed it onto the new tie rod, and they were indeed the same. And then I lined them up to make sure that they were indeed the same length, and they pretty much are here. There you go. Yeah, they're the same length, same thread. So I'm going to take the new tie rod and put it on 14 1/2 turns, and that should get me into the ballpark. And while I'll still need to get in alignment, this should be very close. Alright, the new tie rod is installed. Now this new tie rod has a locking nut, and it kept wanting to spin the ball joint around, so what I did was jack it up just a little bit, put a little pressure on it, and I was able to tighten it up then. So alright, last night I got the belts and the timing belt cover back on. We're about to wrap up the engine here. The only thing I need to do is get the J-boot and the airbox back in here, and we'll fill this with coolant and we'll be ready to go. Before that, I'm going to be changing the plugs. I've got some NGK coppers here, and that's going to do it. We'll be ready to fire this thing up. So alright, I got the spark plugs in now, And now I want to get the car back on the ground before I put the airbox and the coolant in. So I'm going to go ahead and change this tie rod over here. And I thought I'd show you guys what this looked like. I think the other wheel was actually worse than this, but this one's still pretty bad. So that's what a bad tie rod looks like. And this is the wheel I've already changed the tie rod on. And as you can see, I can't move it at all. Alright, I got the driver's side wheel off now, and I'm getting ready to change this tie rod. I thought I would show you this. When I pulled the wheel off, there was a little puddle of brake fluid here and in the rim, and I thought I would just investigate what's going on here. The hoses look dry, so I don't want to jump to any conclusions. The only area that looks sort of wet still is coming from around the caliper seal, so I'm going to remove the caliper and the brake pads and just see what's going on in there, and if I have to, I'll order a rebuild kit. I have the tie rods in now, so I'm getting ready to install the J-boot and the airbox. I have the J-boot here, and I thought I'd show you the ports on them, so that way it'd make it easier to put back together. Right up here near the throttle body, you can see this one here that comes off the air oil separator. And if you flip it over, you're going to find one right up near the airflow meter, and it's for your AAV or ISV depending on years. So alright, I now got the J-boot on and both of my hoses are connected. If you leave these hoses off or you don't get them tight enough, then it can let unmetered air in and the car won't run well. So I'm getting ready to put the airbox in now, and beforehand I want to go ahead and plug in the throttle switch here. So now everything but the airflow meter is plugged in. So alright, I now have the airbox in, and in case you've taken this apart and don't remember how to get back together, I thought I'd show you how it bolts in. Right here you've got two bolts with big washers that go on the front. Then you're going to have two smaller bolts that go into this bracket back here. And if you have an early car, then you're going to mount this device to the bracket also. And I've got my hose clamp tightened down there. Now I just need to plug in the airflow meter and get the upper half in, and we'll be good to go. So alright, the only thing left to do here is fill the car with coolant and start her up. Alright, so I'm going to start by leaving this side of the car on the jack stands and then removing this side. So that way the car is going to sit at an angle and make the expansion tank the highest point in the cooling system. Once that's done, I'm going to remove the bleeder screw here with a 12mm wrench. And as I fill the system, that's where all the air is going to come out. So in replacing the coolant cap, it's important to note that the early cars use a 100 kPa cap, while the later cars use a 150 kPa cap. So alright, we have the engine back together and we're getting ready to fire it up for the first time. Alright, we got the car fired up last night, and so far it's running great with no oil leaks, and the coolant has been bled. The next time you see this car, I'm going to be taking it in to have the alignment checked. And I guess that's going to do it for this mega episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.